geographically, Mexico belongs to North America. And culturally, though, we belong to Latin America. We have this Spanish common heritage, language, culture, etc. So for Mexico, this is a difficult act to balance in terms of the public policy and in terms of how we deal being in the middle exactly of the largest economy of the world and taking advantage of it also, but also being linked with Latin America through Central America and then Southern America. So for immigration purposes, we have also lived with this issue, and I say issue because it has been part of our lives historically. Migration to the north has been part of Mexico's and Latin America's history. And the way things have evolved and the phases we've been through now have different repercussions. So Mexico has dealt with immigration. Mexico, we used to be pourers of immigrants. That is to say that the Mexican workers, mainly young male workers, used to immigrate and go north. Then we started to see the flow of Latin Americans and people from Central America going the same way, the same path to the north. Somehow we reached a peak of Mexican immigration around a decade ago, and then Mexican inflow of immigrants started descending up to the point that we basically can say that until last year, that we had even a net zero immigration in terms of Mexican immigration, I must stress. So that means that more Mexicans were coming back from the US than Mexicans going to the US, Mexican immigrants. But then the shift in the composition in the migrant flow started to change a few years ago, because then the Latin America and particularly Central America, what is called the Northern Triangle, people coming from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, started coming, but at large scale. So at the same time, the composition, the segment of this inflow of immigrants, of undocumented immigrants, started to change. What we used to see as the migration of young male workers started slowly to shift into this also unaccompanied minors that used to go through Mexican territory and to reach the border, searching for better better opportunities for them, and many of them searching for their families, their relatives that were already in the US. But it started to be a problem, because unaccompanied minors, as you might imagine, are subject to all kinds of abuse within the Mexican territory, and then when they reached the US. And there was also a major shift in the recent years when this composition of the immigration flow also started to see some changes. And then there were not only the young male workers, not only the unaccompanied minors, but now families with women, children, grandparents that were fleeing from, particularly from Central America, as I mentioned, because of the conditions, of the economic conditions, of the political instability, very much because of insecurity, of gangs, because this now families, the whole families, were subject to theft, to kidnapping, to abduction from the criminal gangs. So this started to change slowly but surely, and sort of materialized in what we came to know as the caravanas. So caravanas of thousands of people, but families included, started to go through Mexico and to trying to reach their goal, of course, had always been to go through Mexico, not to stay in Mexico, but to reach the US. And this started to pose a problem. Of course, being the inflow of migrants higher, also a problem in terms of security. And the Mexican government had sort of managed, but then they started to be sort of unmanageable. And by this, I mean that when we had the change of government in 2018, with the arrival of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, left wing for the first time in Mexico, and a leftist government and a leftist campaign. Part of the campaign was, of course, centered in the immigration issue, regarded as an absolute human right. So the proposal of this new government was to allow anybody to come through Mexico, to transit through the Mexican territory with no restrictions, and to reach the US, and then, well, you know, they would face there the natural barrier of the border and of the authorities, the US authorities. So this problem was magnified during the first months. The AMLO government started in December of 2018. So exactly a year ago, 6 months into the new administration, things got out of control. And there was a crisis exactly on June, the first week of June of 2019. And the crisis came because the apprehensions by the CBP, the Customs and Border Patrol in the US, reached apprehensions of undocumented immigrants, reached a peak of 144,000 people on only in May. So you could see the inflow and the caravanas getting larger and larger, and the inflow of immigrants from Central America that started to grow and to multiply. So in June, the Trump administration sort of said enough, and they halted or intended to halt the problem by threatening to impose tariffs on Mexican exports. So by mixing the commercial issues with immigration issues, what they forced basically to the Mexican government was to change and to make a U-turn, to change 180 degrees what the previous policy had been of open borders. And that had to come to a complete stop. What has happened since then? Well, of course, the crisis, we managed to get to control the crisis. Of course, the pandemic now sort of helped in terms of a lot less people coming into the border. But just to give you an idea, if you think about the 144,000 people detained at the border in May of 2019, by the beginning of this year, January, February, we were, the detentions fell down to 35,000, 40,000 people. So to levels which were not seen since 2018, so before even the arrival of the new administration. So you could say that the strategy, the US strategy, worked at a great cost, I should say, for Mexican authorities, not only politically, as I mentioned, because they had to change the policy altogether, but also in terms of resources, because President López Obrador created the National Guard, intended to be sort of like a police, military police, originally destined to control violence and cartels related violence. But then he had to allocate a large part of this, a large number of this National Guard to the southern border, exactly to control this issue. So this has been costly. And I would just say that, as I mentioned before, I think we have succeeded in terms of crisis management, but the fundamentals, the problem of the immigration flows, the growing immigration flows, is not solved at all. So we still have that problem. And I think, and I'm convinced that after the pandemic, so in a post-COVID-19 scenario, this could even worsen, because due to the economic recession that we are already starting to feel and aggravated by COVID-19, chances are that not only immigration from Central America, but now again, immigration from Mexico, which had been practically reduced to zero, will start to push to the north again. Regarding our relationship with Central America, before the pandemic, because I think we have to make this distinction now, because it's going to affect, to hit very hard immigration issues. We don't know exactly to what extent, but we had this issue before, and the Mexican government tried to present a plan to the U.S., a two-phase plan, which essentially is well thought, but now we have to see the effects. So they said, okay, we're going to take control of the southern border, forget about the open doors policy. We're going to send around 25,000 troops to the southern border to control just the main entrance of the Central American immigrants. But at the same time, Mexican government proposed like this development, the shared development strategy, which is okay. So that's saying we are not going to solve the problem unless we solve the issues that make people migrate. So if we don't have economic conditions for people to stay in their countries, they will keep on going north. So that, I mean, that makes absolute sense. The thing is how we're going to do that, because we have seen in the past that it's easier said than done to create not only economic, because as I mentioned, it's not only a term of economic opportunities, but also the social environment and the security and the violence issues. So Mexican government allocated 30 million pesos, which is not a great amount of money, to each of these countries, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Mexico pledged this amount in order to develop jobs and to create jobs. We don't know exactly what has happened with those resources, or if the jobs are actually being created. So it was a transfer of money, and also a project by the federal government of reforesting poor regions and poor zones of the country. So Mexico pledged this amount of money, and also sort of know-how and resources for reforesting the countrysides and poor villages and poor regions of this northern triangle. That has been what we are trying to do, and trying to get the U.S. involved. The U.S. hasn't actually given any money. They said that they were okay with the idea of developing economic infrastructure and market jobs in the Central American countries, but they didn't give actually any money so far. And we don't know exactly, as I mentioned, in terms of how these resources, the ones from Mexico, have been used and implemented. So that's a big question mark over there. But the strategy in terms of international cooperation is good. The thing is that you need to do something at a more fast pace that would take generations, and that could take decades to materialize. And on the other side, the people that managed to seek asylum on the U.S. side, but that were forced to stay in Mexican territory while their their asylum petitions are processed, have also increased because this was a change in the US policy. The US usually let those people in and stay within the US territory while their petitions were processed. Now, what you call them, what you say, like the Remain in Mexico program, that became also sort of like a de facto third country. I'll say third country, and I say de facto because it wasn't approved, or that proposal didn't go through Congress in Mexico. So it was just an executive arrangement on the part of the US and accepted by Mexico, that these people that we're talking about 60,000 people along the border on the Mexican side that are waiting for this process. That is another problem for Mexico, because we were not prepared in terms of infrastructure, of the city's infrastructure, and the possibilities to absorb, as I say, not only working force, but families altogether. So you suddenly had to be able to provide health attention, even education. The range of time to these asylum petitions in the US can go for years, up more than 2 years, and sometimes the process is very slow. So you could think how we are going to deal in terms of how we're going to host and feed and have, as I mentioned, health services, education services, and some working possibilities for all these people. So that is an ongoing issue for Mexico. Also aggravated by the pandemic. We haven't had a sort of crisis on that front, but we do have on the border some hotspots where coronavirus spread among these migrants sort of facilities. As I said, we belong, culturally to Latin America, but Mexico has had a difficult relationship within Latin American countries, because there's always this Latin American countries sometimes resent our looking north and feeling, being part of the North America region more than the Hispanic America or Latin America segment of the continent. So it's been a difficult situation. That's a good point, because we are trying to, as I said, balance that situation, and we have been very outspoken about our brothers and sisters in Latin America, but actually we haven't done that much. I'll give you just an example. We are very vocal and outspoken about the rights of migrants, particularly the rights of all Mexican migrants in the US. But we have a very, very stiff migration system. So it's not easy at all to come to Mexico and process an asylum petition, for instance, or migration status, resident statuses. It's very hard. So there's sometimes this contrast between what we are sort of demanding for Mexican immigrants abroad, mainly in the US, of course, and what we as a country offer. The crisis, the Caravana crisis, showed us that more blatantly, because as people were pouring into the country and then stopped at the northern border, so sort of stuck in Mexico, which is not their destination, their choice of destination. These people want to go to the US. So they were sort of stuck in Mexico. What we saw, and I'm sorry to say that, but it's true, is how people not always react very welcomingly. And there were issues at the southern part of Mexico because of the flow and the arrival of these people. As I mentioned, we were not prepared. And when I say we, I mean the structurally, the infrastructure facilities we did not have, because we were used to see people, go through Mexico, but not stay in Mexico, not remain in Mexico, as the program says. So this has posed significant issues for the Mexican authorities and also for the Mexican authorities in states and at the local level where states are poor. So the southern states of Mexico are traditionally the poorest states. So imagine when you have on top of that an inflow and a very, sudden inflow of thousands of migrants. So that is a problem. And we'll have to address that in order to also manage to absorb the migrants that we can absorb, but also it's going to be a problem on how we repatriate or how we manage this flow of people if the intention of Mexico is to help build economic and employment opportunities in their countries of origin. So that would be like the logical development. But as I mentioned, that is a very long-term goal, even if it's the appropriate goal. So that is going to pose a problem. And we have another problem because of this hardship situation in Latin America and in Central America. Now we've also become a country of destiny for many of them that said, okay, if the northern border is to the US is going to be closed, well, I might choose to stay in Mexico and then apply for asylum. And we were not ready for that either. So because we usually have few, compared with what happens in the US, we have a lot fewer applications for asylum, and those have doubled since the crisis. And I will just give you a quick. We had in 2019 70,000 altogether applications for asylum, and now that has doubled, and we have now 149,000 applications. So for the system, for the Mexican immigration system and authorities, this has also been, completely unmanageable. Of course, as I said, and as I mentioned, now with the pandemic, the flow has almost stopped, and that would give some air. But it's only my fear that it's only for this months of the lockdowns, and that people are halted. Because after that, I'm afraid that this will come again, and that's what I said. Structurally, we haven't solved the problem, not with our neighboring countries at the south, and not with the U.S. And we will have to deal with that. Interestingly enough, we have petitions of asylum from the Northern Triangle countries, but also from Venezuela, for instance. We have a larger amount of people from Venezuela seeking asylum in Mexico, not in the US, but in Mexico, from Cuba, from Haiti, and even from Southern America. So this is something we'll have to face. What the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic has shown us is that international cooperation is necessary more than ever, and that we have to find common solutions to our common problems, which are not going to stop. And I say that also thinking about Europe and the European Union and what we have in America and Latin America. I think we have to be creative. We have to look for different options, think outside of the box, and try to come with more inclusive solutions for everybody, because the problems and the structural problems are not going to be solved anytime soon. And we have to address this issue, particularly immigration, I think, with a fresh start, and addressing the rights of the orderly and proper immigration, but also the human rights side, and we have to address that.